fellow Redditors, what was a moment where you thought a person you knew might be an actual psychopath? I'm a college librarian. He was one of my students who came in a lot. He was super charming and good looking and altogether empty inside, no depth, no emotions, no regard for others. One of our staff straight up said, "That boy's a psychopath." She had been a social worker, so I trusted her opinion and agreed. He collected types of women. He told me about seducing a female, married, military chaplain and getting her to do sexual things she didn't want to. Then he got bored with her and moved on. He eventually got his master's degree and now works on the military base making big bucks, getting everyone else to do his work for him. Sometimes psychopaths are dangerous in other ways. When I was about 7 or 8, there was a kid who was about 6. We found a baby bird that fell out of its nest. In the time it took for me to go home and tell an adult, he put it in the road and ran over it on his bike and laughed. Last I heard, Hess in jail for beating his girlfriend. Fuck you, Kevin. When I was 8, I let my older cousin, who was probably 11 or 12 at the time, hold my hamster. She was being really rough with it, so I told her to put it back into its cage. She got really mad after this and just stared at me for about 2 minutes before she turned around and threw my hamster into the wall. My poor hamster died instantly and I was crying because my hamster had just gotten murdered. I knew after she threw it something was extremely wrong with her, and my mom made my aunt come and pick her up, and she wasn't allowed to be near any animals after this. It's been almost 4 years since I've talked to her, but apparently she gets into fights almost weekly, and beat somebody so bad they had to go to ER. She's in therapy and has spent time in juvenile detention. All of my other cousins are afraid of her and many of us think she's going to eventually kill somebody. I honestly think the best place for her would be a mental health hospital. He set fire in the attic 3 times. Was disgusted by all animals and would try and abuse our cat whilst we weren't there or looking. Went out and bought a load of knives and swords and kept them in his bed. One of my neighbors when I was little had some hamsters. One day I was at her house and she started squeezing them and making them poop because she thought it was funny. She just kept squeezing them harder and harder. I told her to stop or she might hurt them and she started laughing. The next day I asked her grandma what happened to her hamsters and she told me they all died. Another time we were making PB&J sandwiches in her room. I'd cry lol, and she cornered me with the knife while laughing. I looked her up a few years ago and found her mugshot. Played soccer with a guy in high school that had a real short temper and enjoyed playing the sport as rough as possible. Even at practice, coaches had to tell him to calm down all the time. Everyone hated him and stayed away from him. Several years later he murdered a classmate of mine over some weed. He hid the body under a pile of leaves in his backyard. When I heard the news, I wasn't surprised in the least. My older sister used to absolutely torture me when I was a kid. When I was 5 to 6, she was 7 to 8, I was afraid of bugs. She would spend hours trapping bugs and putting them in my Matchbox cars. Then she'd say, "Hey, science forbid, wanna play cars?" I would get super excited because she never wanted to play with me. I'd run to my cars and there would be bugs crawly all over. Then when I was 7, I was obsessed with Barbies. One day she grabbed my favorite Barbie and Ken and threw them under the bed. I stuck my tongue out at her and climbed under the bed to get them. As I army crawled in the cramped space, my arms started to hurt. I was getting pricked all over every time I moved, and I was bleeding. It took me until I was halfway way under the bed to figure out what my psychopath sister had done. She had spent all morning weaving push pins into the carpet so the points would stick up and stab me. She then tricked me into climbing under the bed. So, there I am, halfway in with my precious Barbie and Ken at the back wall. I had to decide to cut my losses and abandon Barbie and Ken, or climb the rest of the way through the Sawyesk minefield and back out. I bit the bullet. Amy, if you read this, fuck you. I was in the military and my roommate was overprotective over all of my stuff, never wanted me to share, it was either his or mine. Couch, remote, TV, PS4. Like guys can't be on the TV together. Anyways, he gets snacks from home sent to him and a rat gets in and eats his food. He stays up for 3 days looking for this rat, doesn't sleep until he catches it, and then proceeded to cut off his toes, fingers, paws and legs in the open courtyard by us so that the other mice learn their place by hearing its screams. I wasn't home when this happened, I was on base. Other housemates explained in detail when I got there, warning me. Left the next day. A few years ago, I had to put my cat, Rex, down. He was 21 years. In passing, not too long ago, I mentioned this to a friend I've known for over 35 years. Out of nowhere he made the statement, "I always liked killing cats." I did a double take to see if he was kidding. He wasn't. Haven't spoken to him since. My dad said for years that someone I knew at primary school, 7 to 11, was a psychopath because he often got in fights with random people and showed no empathy after breaking their bones, and he would often lie about staff to get them in trouble. I thought he was scary and a bit violent but an alright guy overall. I found out a couple of years ago he's been sentenced to life for murder. She kicked my leg while we were ice skating to make me fall. I really hurt my back, I couldn't get up, could barely talk and had trouble breathing. I asked her please to call someone but she just stood there and laughed at me for a few minutes until I was able to crawl to my phone and call someone. She also said to my adopted brother that he is worth nothing because even his real parents left him in the trash. It was the only time I ever punched someone in the face. When my ex-boss at the youth service actually barricaded the door of her office to stop me leaving. She had me cornered in my wheelchair, the office was too small for me to turn around. Meanwhile my colleagues were outside the office literally trying to break the door down to rescue me. He kicked my dog, and when I told him off, he said something along the lines of well it's not like it's feeling matter. Another friend said how would you feel if we kicked you? And he said that we couldn't do anything that would hurt him. I think he joined the military, but I honestly have lost all contact. When he beat up my grandma with an exercise bike. When I had a parent-teacher conference with a student of mine's mom and dad. This was maybe 15 years ago, but it stuck with me. The daughter had some minor issues with math, 3rd grade, and the father insisted that he was a physics professor at an Ivy League university nearby. When I told him his daughter was struggling with the US standard algorithm, he got upset and told me he didn't understand what the word algorithm means. And he's a physics professor? Okay. When I began to explain, his face got completely flat and devoid of any expression. His wife immediately noticed the look on his face, he was staring right at me, not blinking or saying anything, and her face blanched, and she started pulling on his arm and trying to get his attention, off me, I assume. When I described it later, I called it a serial killer face. He eventually let her pull him out of the room and end the conference. I immediately told my principal and said I refused to do another conference alone with these people. I definitely felt as though if I were alone with this man, he would have come after me physically. His wife's response was very telling. I only dealt with her from then on. When I found out that, as a child, he'd bury cats with just their heads sticking out, and run them over with a lawnmower. He walks this earth a free man. I went to high school with a guy, we weren't close but had a lot of mutual friends so we were around each other a lot. Once he beat a guy with a tire iron when the guy tried to scam him when he was selling some weed or something. Later on, he went to Iraq and was in some shit. He came home on leave at some point and I was at a bar playing pool with him and he nonchalantly talked about killing people over there. Said he enjoyed it. He was always very calm and chill when I was around him, but I tried to avoid him after that there was something broken in there. The weirdest part is that he would have these moments or anecdotes of extreme violence, but he always related them calmly. Never felt any sort of regret for any of it. Obviously you can't diagnose someone off of that sort of thing, but I've read that sociopaths make good soldiers and he was fairly successful in the army, I believe. My period was late and I had let the dude know it was first time my period was ever late while on birth control pills but I had recently switched to a different one. He immediately started blaming me for not taking my birth control right and that if I was pregnant he would kill me. I even told him I doubted I was pregnant and not to worry and that the doctor told me that it might happen. He found God 3 times in the course of a year. Each time after he had been seen doing significant property damage or emotionally abusing a girl he was with. Like the God thing was a quick trick to get people off his ass. When my best friend asked me to find a cat and kill it with her in her backyard. We broke contact after that. Heard from a mutual friend it was actually confirmed by her therapist that she was an actual sociopath a few months later. Edit. A few people have pointed out that this couldn't have been confirmed by her therapist. Remember, this was information which went off at least 2 other teenagers before it came to me. The explanation of what was wrong with her may have been oversimplified to sociopath or lost in translation along the way. Or completely fabricated, for all I know, but that was the message I got. I went to university with a guy I am positive is a psychopath. Quite pleasant to be around but he has no regard whatsoever for you. Quite charming actually and the best ladies man I've ever seen. But once he fucks them he's done. Like literally they don't exist to him. I've seen him break up 2-year-long relationships of other people then dump the girl the morning after. I suspected he was a psychopath but we took a psych class together and he confirmed it to me. Like straight up told me he'd been diagnosed as a teen. I wouldn't call him a bad guy but he didn't see me or anyone else as human. Just things he enjoyed interacting with. Played D&D and board games with him for years. Still have him on my Facebook but haven't seen him in like a decade. I met an individual who later pled guilty to his involvement in about 14 murders. During an interview about his childhood and personal life, it became very apparent that he had no interest in other people and they were basically NPCs to him, even his girlfriend and child. He was in a gang and his behavior was basically shadowing the other guys with status. He had a girlfriend because that's what the other guys did. He had a fancy car. He wore the right clothes. The other guys figured out early on that he was not bothered by murder or gunfights, so he was their hitter. During the interview, he was perfectly polite, but utterly flat in his affect and didn't attempt to dissemble or minimize a lot of terrible things that happened to him or the things he'd done. It made for an interesting interview. My ex-husband would snap, in a split second, between emotional states. He used to make me find sexual situations online, looking through porn, and tell me to pick which made me the most uncomfortable or I didn't want to do. Then he'd do that or make me do it. He'd have sex with me while tears were streaming down my face. Knock my feet out and pin me to the ground until I quit being crazy when I would try to leave him. So many things he did. My ex was always weird and emotionally stunted. Would never come out of his shell or let anyone in, which was a big problem to the relationship. But that's just background. One day we were at our friend's house and the conversation turned to creepy and weird things. He brought up the dark web and said something about a YouTube channel that discussed weird things that can be found on the dark web. Then he asked if we had heard of crush porn and a look on his face and his tone told me that this was more than a casual inquiry. It seemed more like he was gauging us for our reaction to see if we were into crush porn. We asked what it was and he said it was videos of women in stiletto heels crushing things like kittens, filmed from below through glass and the like. It was oddly specific, and still his tone and careful considering expression told me he was hyper aware of our reaction. When we reacted negatively to that being a thing, he immediately switched gears and started laughing like, right, how could anyone be into that? When I finally did break things off, we had a heart-to-heart about all the ways our relationship had deteriorated. He was able to admit that he never let me in because he was afraid I wouldn't be able to handle the truth. Still have no idea what he was hiding. But I think it may have been at least partially related to the crush porn conversation, among other things. This one won't be crazy or frightening, but I remember the point at which I recognized sociopathy in my ex. We sat down on his bed at night and I asked him to tell me things about himself, because even though we were dating I knew nothing about him. He could not give an answer beyond surface level on any emotional topic. I looked in his eyes and saw nothingness. I realized why I could never emotionally read him or get any sort of feel. He did tell me after we broke up that he can't feel emotions and how much it sucks. I didn't understand this until much later. Before we dated, I remember him telling me how manipulative he is, with a smile. He lied constantly about everything and had 15 other relationships before me, all ending within a month. Yes, an obvious red flag that I ignored. He would jump from religion to atheism every other month. He would repeat cycles over and over. He was known by everyone and liked by many. Very charming. Had a flirty personality. Loved risk-taking for no reason. Always got into trouble. I think I might have posted about this before, but there was a guy I was in a couple clubs with in high school. He was always really polite but intense. Like the kind of intense you didn't want to make direct eye contact with, if that makes any sense. Anyway, one day we're walking back from McDonald's or somewhere together before our club started. It's just the two of us, and out of nowhere he starts talking about how he's a black belt in some martial art, and gleefully tells me about how in one of his classes they had just learned how to break someone's neck in one move, and how cool it was. I was like, huh. Okay then. That's interesting. And just let him go on his merry way. In the back of my mind I was going, this dude is totally going to kill somebody someday. Years later, he makes the local news. Not for murder, but sexual assault. I dated a cop for about a month and a half. He was super controlling and obsessive. We went on a trip where he met my best friend and he was super pissed the whole time. I think it was because we spent a lot of time with my friend and we didn't have alone time. Anyways, we drove back and during the whole drive he was asking, "You're not going to break up with me, right?" He was driving my car and I was kind of scared tbh. He was trying to talk about my past and would get mad because he would ask questions and I would answer. Like if I wasn't allowed to have dated anyone before him. We get to his house because he needed to be dropped off and I could go back home. But he told me to get out of the car and he came face to face with me and told me that I better not break up with him. I remember him saying a few other things that made me feel super unsafe. I just said no and then left. I got home and texted him telling him it was over. I was living with my parents at the time, but I have a feeling if I lived alone, he would have showed up at my house. He blew up my phone to the point that I couldn't be on it. He was non-stop texting and calling till the morning. He called me every name under the sun and tried to make me feel like crap, but I was just shocked that someone would stoop as low as he did. Edit. He also made racist remarks against Asians and Hispanics. My best friend is Asian and her boyfriend and I are Hispanic. I think that's when I really noticed that there was something really wrong with him. It was weird. Update. Ended up calling the precinct he worked at when I knew him and they said someone would call me back within the next few days. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.